we got to ask ourselves, is the snowball easier to stop at the top of the hill or the avalanche midway down the hill or at the bottom of the hill? So the more you train yourself to recognize those triggers, I have a martial arts background, so my hands start to kind of clench and I start feeling the pulse in my fingers almost.
Welcome to Between the Briefs, a podcast by Steno. We share practical tips and expert insights on the pretrial process, court reporting, and legal technology to keep you updated on how technology is revolutionizing the litigation process and the wider legal sector. I'm your host, Adrian.
Hello and welcome to Between the Briefs, brought to you by Steno. I'm your host, Adrian, and today we are joined by Shahrad Milanfar, a seasoned trial attorney, mediator, and pioneer in integrating technology into the courtroom. With over 22 years of experience, Shahrad has handled high-stakes personal injury cases, including catastrophic injury, wrongful death, and elder abuse, securing record-breaking verdicts along the way, including a $32 million award in an elder abuse case. In addition to his legal practice at Milanfar Law, Shahrad is also an educator, having taught trial skills at Golden Gate University School of Law and coached at the National Institute for Trial Advocacy. He's passionate about using technology to enhance trial presentations and is a staunch advocate for mentorship in the legal profession. Shahrad, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you both for having me.
Of course, man. I'm really happy to have you on. Now, I kind of want to just start at the beginning. I know you had a very successful career as a district attorney. Is that correct?
Yeah, so what I did was I essentially went to the DA's office in San Francisco and spent 6 months volunteering to get trial experience. So I wanted to get the backbone of having that experience of being in a courtroom day in and day out because I ultimately wanted to become a district attorney, but that didn't go as I wanted it. So I then switched paths and went into the civil track.
Nice. So you were in the, you wanted to get that trial experience. Do you feel like you got that even in the slightest when you went to, try to work in the district attorney's office?
So I went to Golden Gate Law School in San Francisco, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but that's a different conversation. But the person who ran the program was my mentor, Bernie Siegel, really focused on trial practice. So we would actually get to go and try cases and do mock trial practice at the courthouse on Bryant Street, which is a criminal courthouse. So once I got to the DA's office, I'd already spent, hundreds of hours in that courthouse as part of that program. And it just was another building block on top of the skills that I had learned from Bernie Siegel and in his program in order to just add on and keep building the foundation that I needed to do what I do today.
Well, Shahrad, I was going to ask you, I am a defense lawyer it's one of the things that I do. And I am on the public defender's side. I've never been in private practice. It's been more about sort of standing on the other side of the aisle from what DAs do. I think it used to be the case that people would say, if you want to get trial experience, go to the prosecutor's office. That's the most reliable way forward. Do you think that's changed over the years? Do you see that trial skills can be developed from all sides now?
I think you have to be creative and take ownership of your skill set and your development as a lawyer. A lot of times attorneys wait for others to give them opportunities, but in reality, you have an opportunity every day, whether it's how you speak to other people or giving talks. Like I joke that I gave a talk one time and it was an auditorium that sat 500 and 3 people showed up. And people were like, do you want to cancel? No, I don't want to cancel. I want that discomfort and I want those 3 people to leave with something amazing that they have experienced and, say, you know what, I learned something, right? So to me, there is a lot of different paths to becoming a trial lawyer. The question is, are people willing to put in the work? Now, the PD's office and the DA's office certainly do provide that opportunity. But if you're a young associate in a civil firm, getting to go to depositions, getting to ask and prepare clients for depositions, all of those things are things you can do. In our firm, we also do improv, right? Learning how to do improv, right? Learning how to do storytelling. We've brought in a storyteller named Joel Ben-Izzy out of Berkeley to teach us how to do storytelling. And that's from the intake people all the way to all the attorneys, right? So these are things that you have to do on your own. And, frankly, if you haven't heard of the program Improv for Trial that Brian Breiter puts on, he's a good friend of mine, and he does an amazing job with Joseph Limbaugh. So what are you doing as a lawyer, right, to develop the little things that will make you a great trial lawyer when you walk into that courtroom, so it's not a foreign experience to you of how to relate to other human beings and how to tell a story that the jurors are going to feel compelled to essentially award a large verdict on.
It sounds like you focus a lot on education, both for the people that work in your office and also in your experience. What made you really want to become more of an educator in your career on top of just being an attorney?
It's pretty simple. I've had a lot of people who have taken a lot of interest in my development and helped me, right? We talked about Bernie Siegel. There's Romeo Garcia, who was a mentor of mine when I was in the Upward Bound program, right? There's another attorney named Douglas Davies, or, good friends of mine who are not even in law, who've taken an interest in my development and my success. So to me, giving back seems like the normal and natural thing to do, and helping other people refine their crafts and become better at making our profession something that we can be proud of is an important thing for me to hopefully help foster, so that the younger attorneys don't go to law school and then end up being miserable for 30 years in their career. And essentially look like they got run over by the profession by the time they're my age. So if we can help people not spend, tens of years of their lives in law school and training and then be miserable in their profession, to me, that's a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you want to put that kind of good back into the world?
Shahrad, this is amazing. I love this as someone who I also teach, and I teach trial skills too. And you immediately are hitting on things that I think are just so important to the practice as well. Storytelling as an art is I think maybe the most critical. I'm curious, maybe just my first question on this would be, do you think that there's a class that is not taught in law school that should be taught in law school?
There's a lot of classes that aren't taught in law school that should be taught in law school. I mean, let's be realistic. Law school doesn't teach you about being a full and complete lawyer, right? Because a lot of times when people go to law school, they see, their dream is to be with 1,000 lawyer firm and be with this big firm. Well, in reality, what does that really mean, right? Does law school teach you what that really means? Does that mean you're going to be doing document review for 8 years of your practice and not know what the inside of a courtroom looks like or what a deposition is? And I've interviewed folks who were transitioning out of big law, and you ask them, well, how many depositions have you taken? And this guy was 8 years in a big law firm. Oh, well, I've prepared the senior partner for, what does that mean? Right? So there is a lot that goes into it, but at the end of the day, the attorneys should take an active role in learning about business, learning about the mechanics of the case, persuasion. Everybody thinks, that being a lawyer is arguing, right? How many times have you heard somebody say, "Oh, my kid is really argumentative. We've told him or her that they should go to law school." Well, it's not about arguing, right? If I'm truly an effective lawyer, I'm going to persuade the opposing lawyer. I'm going to persuade the adjuster. And if that doesn't work, I'm going to persuade 12 people that the result that I'm looking for is the appropriate result for this case and our client. And those are things that I think are lost a lot of times when people go to law school, because you look at it, yeah, great, you can analyze the letter of the law. That's important. But the question is, can you read between the lines and the nuances and understand the big picture in a way that's persuasive to the opposing lawyer, adjuster, judge, and ultimately a jury?
It's a great point. And I'm curious, tell me more about Milanfar Law. How did that come to fruition? When was it created? When were you like, I need to create my own practice here to achieve my goals that I have?
So I was with another firm for 19 years, essentially doing catastrophic injury work on the defense side. And in January of 2020 is when I opened this firm. And as you may have guessed, that wasn't the best timing because it was right before the pandemic. But in a sense, I operate really well under pressure. So that was a motivation to me. And I had people who followed me from my old firm to this firm. And I take my responsibility to our clients and to our staff and, frankly, my family very seriously, because I was never going to go to any of them and say, sorry, we don't have the money to pay you, right? So it really helped us to become very creative in terms of how we do things and to do it in a way that allowed us to get some big results for our clients. And, frankly, it was fantastic to see the support of lawyers that I had even gone against as a defense lawyer to support our firm and refer cases and help us with, moving forward, or even advice. I've had, people I've called and they sat on the phone with me for 2 hours telling me, hey, I made these mistakes. Watch out and don't do this, which was fantastic.
Shahrad, you talked just a second ago about creativity and obviously the need to adjust and be creative in your practice, especially as you open. And what did that look like? What are some examples of that?
Well, I mean, looking at the big picture, right? I'm not very good at drawing, for example, right? And when it comes to creativity, I'm terrible at the drawing. But when it comes to storytelling and looking at problems in different ways, I take pride in having developed that skill set, right? So for me, having had the years of experience doing defense work, I've done almost 120 mediations as a mediator, and then now the plaintiff's work, it allows me to be able to see these problems, which is what our clients come with, right? They come to us with a problem in their life. And for me, if I'm successful, I let them leave with one less thing to worry about. Right. And usually our clients are in a horrible situation. And what we're doing is to come in and say, all right, what can we do to make this a little bit easier for them? So being creative in looking at the big picture, how do we tell that story and how do we tell it in a way that is compelling, I think is huge, because we've taken cases where the other side has said, you know what? The case is worth nothing. We've had prior counsel who've, essentially not worked it up properly, and we've brought it in, worked it up, and gotten, multiple seven-figure settlements on those cases. So I take pride in looking at every case as a potential trial candidate and really helping good people that are in a really horrible place, not because of anything they did, but because of a choice that somebody else made that put them in that position.
You mentioned seeing every case as, it could go to trial. You could provide the best outcome for your client. Do you feel that having a great team has kind of contributed to that? Like I read that your spouse is heavily involved with helping you run Milanfar Law. Do you think that's provided a great, almost like an edge for you when it comes to taking on these cases?
Absolutely. I mean, look, when we look at the legal profession, especially litigation and catastrophic injury litigation, there is a lot of stress that comes in from outside of our walls, right? We have, it's competitive in the sense that the other side is willing to do just about anything to defeat our case, including not telling us the proper policy limits, not providing documentation or information for years until we just dig and dig and dig and we get it, right? So one of the things that we try to do in our firm is to make sure that everybody understands that they're supported by me and everybody on our staff. So we don't tolerate people who are jerks in our firm. And that, I think, helps us because we have staff members who've worked with me for, 7 to 10, 12 years. Why? Because we support each other. And I know when I say, please do this, I don't have to think twice about it. And the most important thing, I think, for us is that every one of our staff members truly cares about our clients. They really want our clients to succeed. And frankly, we work with only clients that we like, because if I don't like you, I can't be a good voice for you in the courtroom, right? So in that context, our staff go above and beyond in being courteous and empathetic to our clients. And I think that sets the tone for how our cases go. And it's very different from a lot of volume firms that may be out there doing business.
Shahrad, the things you're saying, the concepts you're hitting on are very near and dear to my heart too. Empathy, culture, internal culture, right? Creating a place where people actually collectively are wanting to do something brilliant for someone else authentically. Yet there is this stereotype, especially of plaintiffs' work, where it's antagonistic. Everything needs to be a fight. And obviously some people are like that, and some people act that way. It seems like you've carved out this approach that's definitely more resonant to me, but you're using words like empathy. You're talking about the soft skills of storytelling. You're talking about persuasion. You're talking about these things that don't immediately come to mind when we think of, like, a plaintiff's attorney. Did it take you a moment to get comfortable with that skill set or with that idea or that approach?
Well, first of all, let's address the stereotype. The stereotype is a stereotype created by people who are essentially trying to tear down our profession, right? And it's not a realistic stereotype, because I know incredible lawyers out there who love their clients and do a significant amount of work. Unfortunately, we have a few bad apples that get all the press of being jerks and, stealing from their clients or whatever. When in reality, what we're doing is working toward making someone, right, as close to whole as possible, when in reality, we all know if somebody loses their arm, there isn't enough money in the world that's going to make them whole, right? What the money does is to help them have one less worry in the world, and that's the financial worry, right? So for me, it's not about arguing with the other side. It's about trying to persuade them that this is the right result. And again, I always tell, even our kids, that people should not confuse kindness with weakness, because I have no problem standing up to defense counsel when they're yelling at me in deposition or objecting to every question, right? There is a place for that where I'm going to hold my ground, and they're going to understand that this is not the person who is going to be pushed around by us. But at the end of the day, the way I try to look at it is I want to persuasively help the other side understand the risk that they have. And that comes from my defense background, right? I know what they need to know to value the case. And if they decide to ignore that, I'm actually not mad about it, because selfishly, I want to go to trial. And if they're going to force me to do that after I go to them repeatedly and say, hey, do you want to settle? Do you want to settle? And they say, no, we want you to go get the money from a jury. That's okay. I'm comfortable getting 12 people to look at this in an objective way and in a human way, as opposed to the idea that a lot of carriers are advancing, as if the plaintiffs are showing up with their hand out looking for something that they don't deserve. When in reality, again, if I offered you 10, 30, 100, $200 million for your right arm, you wouldn't accept that deal.
You mentioned being able to explain things humanly, right? And I think a big portion of that is understanding how humans communicate in our digital age, being able to bring things up that are just easily understood, and technology plays a big role in that. Now, I listened to a podcast once where you explained how in 2014 you tried your first case with an iPad, right? Since then, technology has changed drastically. How are you still incorporating this technology into the courtroom and everything that you do?
So I've tried every case I've tried on the civil side has been with an iPad. That still doesn't change at all, because I know how to use it. I can do it effectively, and it doesn't break my flow when I'm utilizing an iPad. And it allows me the freedom to stand anywhere in the room because you connect wirelessly with the projector or TV or whatever. But as far as technology is concerned, there is a lot of stuff that's coming online that's helping us become more efficient. And what we have to do is simply be curious, right? I mean, whether it's storytelling or technology or how you run your firm, you have to be curious. And I think a lot of times people are either too afraid to do it because they're afraid to fail, or they're too complacent. Hey, this has worked the last 20 years. Well, that doesn't mean it's going to work tomorrow, right? And if we look at just how we do our work and juries, right? How many times a day do you pick up your phone and look at it, right? That's something that's shortening our attention span, and it's hurting us in terms of having personalized connections with people. So we have to look at all these things and say, how is that impacting the practice, and how is that impacting presentations and trial work, and then research and try things out to see how that plays out. And what we see a lot of lawyers getting into trouble for over AI is because they're being lazy about it, right? It spits out a product, somebody looks at it for 10 seconds and says, yeah, go ahead and file it. No, you can't do that. We have to be more vigilant. People will make mistakes, but at the same time, I think if we're a little bit more vigilant and do the work up front, just like trial work, the results happen, right? Because people look at it, and certainly I'm not the only one who's ever gotten a big verdict, but they look at it and they say, oh my God, this big verdict. But nobody looks at the ditch digging that it took to get to that number, and the feeling that you have when the jury reads out, we're awarding your client $32 million.
How are you using AI, Shad?
So I've done a bunch of different research on AI and basically vetted, different tools that help us in terms of how we do our work. And it's ultimately, one, making sure that it's a secure system. And then there's a bunch of different vendors that provide services. So we're still kind of vetting the best product for our firm, but there is a lot of options out there that can be utilized as long as you're reading the terms of service and you understand what you're giving up in terms of client information, and making sure that that information doesn't go into a different silo and can be deleted as you need to delete it once you guys are done creating that initial work product. But again, every piece of AI that's out there that we use, right, has to be treated as a first draft from a first-year associate or a junior paralegal, right? But what it does is it reduces the amount of time you spend on that first draft, because that tends to be, from a mental block standpoint, the hardest draft to get out. Editing is not that hard, but just creating that first draft is difficult. And so that's one of the things that I think is a pain point that can be helped by utilizing AI effectively for various firms.
Is it just like, are you seeing the best benefit for you personally in your firm with AI? Are you seeing it on the sort of the motions practice, the drafting front, or are there other areas of the work that you do where you're also seeing it inserted positively into your workflow?
Well, it depends. The answer to your question is yes, it does help with the drafting, right? Because you can take some garbage discovery responses and dump them in and say, hey, give me 10 requests for admissions. And I take those 10 requests for admissions, I look at the discovery responses and I tweak them, and boom, we have a set of requests for admissions that can be utilized, right? But it's ultimately, how creative and curious are you, right? Sometimes I'm sitting there and I'll open up the AI chatbot and say, ask it, can you do this? Right? I'm just curious. Maybe the answer is nope, can't do it. Or maybe it is, yes, I can do it. And then we vet it. And also, again, don't accept the first answer as the final product. That's a huge tactical error by doing that. Because frankly, if a first-year associate or a law intern handed you a work product, you wouldn't file that with the court. Why would we do it with AI? It's just insane.
It's a very, very good point that it's just kind of crazy that people just take it at face value and they're like, all right, well, this is it. I'm going to go roll with it without understanding the consequences that can come with
And
that.
I'll give you an example. I had a question that I had for AI, and I knew the work product was an old work product that had the wrong code sections in it because the code sections had been renumbered. And I asked it, I was like, hey, what's the code section that governs da-da-da-da-da? And it gave me the old code sections. And then I said, are you sure? The next response was, oh, I apologize. These code sections were updated in 2023, right? So you can test it and see. And to me, what that does is, much like a human being, it makes mistakes. So we can't look at it as this is perfection and we're coming in and accepting everything that it does. It's, hey, you know what? This is an imperfect product that can help me. But the question is, am I going to be skeptical about the response the same way I would be if a human being handed me the same work product? And the answer should be absolutely.
Mm-hmm. You got to have that tinge of skepticism and then take it at you know that there needs to be revisions and add in your own flair into it. That way you get the final product that you want. Now, I'm curious about something you mentioned before, and that's storytelling, right? To really achieve these monumental verdicts that you have in monetary value and just big wins, you have to be able to tell your client's story very well to a jury or in a courtroom. How do you go about creating and really just like vocalizing that story that your client has told you, but now you need to give it to the jury from your own point of view?
It's unique depending on the client, right? And to me, getting to know the client and their family members is a huge part of that. And being able to look at it from a human perspective of being curious, like, how did that affect your life? What were you able to do before that you couldn't do now, right? Because ultimately, when we look at trials, the successful verdicts seem to have a common thread, and that is what was taken away from the person who is filing this lawsuit. And if I can humanize that person and show that something was taken away from that person and be able to tell that story effectively, then the jurors are much more receptive because they look at it and say, yeah, you know what, how is that fair? That this person had this taken away from him, and now this defense lawyer is coming up and saying, you know what, you need to pay this much money for this because we think that that's fair. Well, wait a minute. You didn't ask them what was fair when you took this from them. Why do you have the ability to now put a number on it? Right? So to me, I always say that there's a reason Iranian trial lawyers are good trial lawyers, and that's because Persians and Iranians have had a rich history of storytelling. And we all grew up with bunches of different stories. And I think that really informs us in terms of how we shape the case and how we tell that story. I mean, even sequencing, right? How do you sequence witnesses in a trial to tell that story? People think that, oh, I'll just call this one, this one, this one, this one. No, well, why? What's the story that you're telling? And if I watch a movie, right, they sequence the characters that are coming in and out of the movie. Why is that any different in a trial? And frankly, if I ask you to come and sit in a courtroom for 2 weeks or 6 weeks or a month or 3 months for a trial, do I want you to be interested and curious, or do I want you to be bored to death?
Right. I mean, the answer there is obviously very clear. And when I describe it to my students or to other people, there's a couple of things. It's really in sync with what you're saying. I always talk about the privilege of the work that I get to do as being entrusted with someone's story, usually at their most trying time. And the privilege of the work is then being able to take that story and how much, like, how preciously do we treat that, and how much do we consider it? That, though, is so interesting because what you said earlier is we also live in a world where attention spans are shrinking, stories are being told differently. And so you're being entrusted with a story, you're going to tell it, but you have to be conscious of your audience too. And your audience sometimes is looking at you as the only reason they haven't been able to look at their phone for the last 12 hours.
Right.
And so figuring out all those forces, how teachable do you think those storytelling skills are? Because it feels like some of it for you must be just the way you were raised or innate in some way.
I don't think it's innate in any way, shape, or form, to be honest with you. Because everybody, like I said, looks at the end result, right? But they don't look at the work that it takes to get there, right? When you see a sprinter break the world record for the 100-meter, everybody focuses on that, 10 seconds or 9 seconds of time, when in reality, nobody wants to look at the 4 a.m. practices that person engaged in, right? So storytelling is very teachable. It's very learnable. I, again, don't consider myself a natural extrovert. My wife will tell me that it's very hard to get me to go to a party, but once I get to the party, it's impossible to get me to leave. Why? Because I don't do anything in a half-ass manner, right? I want to be there. I want to engage. I want to learn about this person. I want to tell my clients stories, and I want to really understand how other human beings work. So there is a ton of work that we can do to get to that point. And can I tell you, I all of a sudden became a good storyteller overnight? No, it's a long trajectory of development, of learning those skills, and also showing up authentically when in reality, I think I talked about this on Cooper's Code with Miles Cooper, is if I showed up, maybe 15, 20 years ago, I would be like, oh my God, do Joe and Adrian like me? What's the audience going to think? And now I show up authentically, hoping that my ability to put out some good information and good energy in the world will result in people watching this and saying, you know what, maybe this guy has something to say that's going to help me in the long run. So I think you have to look at it from a big picture standpoint and say, what is it that I'm doing? Am I focusing on my weaknesses, right? When I started, I think jury selection and voir dire were the weakest part of my trial. I think that's the strength in my trial practice now. Why? Because I've given up the idea that I need to be liked by the jury. I don't need to be liked by all of them at first. I joke that, I only need 12 of them to like me at the end of the case. Right? So you can do a lot to develop those skills, and, learning storytelling and improv is significant in doing that. And how do you do that is by learning stress management, right? If you can learn stress management, then half of your brain isn't hijacked by the stress of the situation where you're basically sitting there going, you know what? What if this goes wrong? What if that goes wrong? And I'm a much better lawyer when all of my brain is focused rather than half of my brain.
Mm. Well, can I pick up on something there, Shahrad? Jury selection to me is magical, and there's a huge improv element to jury selection too. What is something that improv has taught you, a couple of concrete things that you've really learned from your improv classes?
Honestly, improv has made me a better listener, right? And as you know, in jury selection, there is a temptation to talk and talk and talk and talk because we're uncomfortable with that silence. And sometimes, even in depositions, right? Somebody gives an answer, there's more. How do you stay calm in the middle of that storm and you let that information organically develop? And for jury selection, right, I used to want to be like, let me tell you this, let me tell you that, let me tell you this. And I didn't realize that was not because it was productive. I was doing it because I was so uncomfortable standing in front of these jurors and going, oh my God, they hate me. Right? And once I became comfortable in my own skin and said, all right, if I'm a genuine and honest human being in front of jurors, they will then look at me and answer me honestly, which is all I can expect. They don't have to agree with anything either lawyer says. As long as they're being honest about it, we get to have a fair chance in that trial.
Now, Shahrad, I'm glad you mentioned Cooper's Code, the podcast that you were on, because you mentioned one thing on there, and we're kind of touching around it, and that's imposter syndrome, right? You get this deep feeling of imposter syndrome when you're doing something. You're like, why should they listen to me? Right? Like, who am I? I'm sure a lot of young attorneys coming into the practice are feeling very similar. What advice would you give them to overcoming this when it comes to law?
So I think I have a PhD in imposter syndrome, right? Because to me, I don't think you're a successful person without that. But as we talked about on Cooper's Code, is it can be a headwind or it can push, right? So the reality of it is, if you are true to your humanity, you are bringing yourself and all of your life experience to the table, and you are working on your own development and really taking joy. As Joe mentioned, it's an honor to be able to do this work, right? We are helping people who would have no voice and no power without us. And to me, when I, get good results for my clients and others find out about the numbers, the first question I get, and the most often asked question, is, when are you retiring? Well, and that's a foreign concept to me, because I don't do this just because of the numbers and the money. I do it because I genuinely love helping my clients. And when a client says to me, "You have no idea what you've done for me. You've changed my life, and now I don't have to worry about this piece of it. I can focus on getting better." What better reward is there than to be able to do that? But oftentimes what happens is people hyper-focus on the stress and not stress management. And when you do that, then all of a sudden the profession starts wearing you down. The pressure starts wearing you down. You're not going to get rid of the pressure, but if you're not productive in how you look at it and how you view what you have to do, then it's something that can tear you down and prevent you from reaching your true potential. Because at the end of the day, I said this to Miles on the podcast, and Joe, you can, chime in on this. I don't think you went to law school because you didn't have enough stress in your life, right? No, nobody said as a kid, "I want to be a lawyer because I'm not stressed out enough." Yet, this is something that we don't deal with as attorneys, right? Why is it that stress management isn't something that everybody's dealing with and essentially trying to work on an hourly basis? Because without it, you're not going to be as productive, and you're not going to be as effective for your clients. And I want to bring my whole self as an attorney and as a human being for my clients, because that's when I know I've outmatched the other side.
So when you get to the point where you're feeling like, okay, this is a high stress moment, or it's in advance of a trial, or those sort of higher leverage moments, are there things that you do now that you've sort of taught yourself to do to really, really, really manage that?
So, obviously there's things you can do on a daily or weekly basis to manage stress, right? There's people meditate, people work out. Obviously sleep is a huge function, a huge piece of it. And that's something that I've struggled with because I'm a night owl, but I also like to get up early in the morning, right? So if you're managing those things continuously, but also when I feel the pressure start to build, or I'm getting angry or something like that, the reality of it is we got to ask ourselves, is the snowball easier to stop at the top of the hill or the avalanche midway down the hill or at the bottom of the hill, right? So the more you train yourself to recognize those triggers, I have a martial arts background, so my hands start to kind of clench and I start feeling the pulse in my fingers almost. I know that's a good time for me to take a deep breath. And learning that breath work of taking deep breaths and slowly exhaling, I've been able to reduce my heart rate from like 135 to 85 within a matter of 30 seconds, right? So if you can do that and recognize, okay, my heart's starting to beat out of my chest, what do I do? Then that's what's going to set you apart from other people who just let it just cascade out of control. So there's little things you can do. But again, as a human being, what works for me is not what works for you or anybody else. So it's a matter of, again, being curious and discovering the various little things that work for you and implementing them in a consistent fashion.
It's fantastic. And Shahrad, thank you so much for joining us here today. Now, before we wrap up, we always ask this question. What is your hottest take on the legal industry right now?
I think it's an industry that's in flux. You've got a lot of different elements that are coming in, and the industry is changing. And I think we all have to change with it and be proactive in our part in changing it in a positive way and not letting outside forces essentially affect how we do our work and how things are perceived, and really having the conviction to say, you know what, I know this is the right path for my clients and I'm going to take it.
All right. That is a great hot take. Now, thank you so much for joining us here today. To all our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, we'll see you on the next one. See you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Up next on Between the Briefs.
I think that there is an intense disaggregation in the legal market between firms that are becoming hyper profitable, almost bank level profitabilities. You're going to see a lot of change, rapid change. Significantly more smaller boutique firms because of pricing issues. The mid-tier firms in the US, you call them the national firms. I think they're extremely vulnerable. And I think in 5 years, a significant number of them will collapse.
Stay tuned for the full interview coming to you soon. Between the Briefs is brought to you by Steno. To find out more about Steno and how we combine exceptional court reporting and litigation support services to deliver a superior litigation experience, visit steno.com. That's STENO.com. And then make sure to search for Between the Briefs in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts, and click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Steno, thanks for listening.